Thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm really excited for this event. I have had sticky notes all over this book because I found it so
Mhm.
informative and it was very refreshing. As someone who looks at Islamophobia every day, it was such an insightful book and helped me look at the issue in a completely different frame. Within the field of Islamophobia, dominant scholarship identifies the issue as a form of racism, where race and religion have become conflated in social structures. This book, Secularism, Race, and the Politics of Islamophobia, makes a new contribution to the Islamophobia is racism thesis, specifically by analyzing how secularism organizes and constructs the racializations of Muslims and perpetuates anti-Muslim racism. So it argues that the Islamophobia is racism argument is restricting as it fails to analyze the concept of religion. And often the conversations we have around Islamophobia are focused on the Muslim individual. But it is limiting as it doesn't capture or address how religion, in particular Islam, is targeted and demonized. To address this, the authors of the book underscore how secularism plays a foundational role in how we understand race and religion today. The contributors call attention to the ways secularism is embedded in and drives the disciplinary institutions of the state, such as political groups, the law, government entities, bureaucracies, how they all authorize racism and the racialization of Muslims and Islam. The book also highlights the intersectionality of Islamophobia, specifically how the different social and political registers through Islamophobia manifest in this experience, i.e., gender and race. So a brief overview of the schedule. I'll introduce our speakers and then we'll go into a moderated Q&A. I'll introduce the speakers and then each of them will give a presentation and then we'll go into moderated Q&A. After that, we'll move into an audience Q&A. So please use the chat function to enter your questions. So our panelists today, we have Dr. Sharmin Siddiqui, who is the editor of the book. She's a cultural anthropologist and the editor of this book. She has spent the last 20 years researching and recording the experiences of Muslim Americans affected by surveillance, terrorism prosecutions, securitized courts and prisons, and their engagement in the social justice movement. We have Dr. Jinan Bastaki, who's an associate professor of legal studies at NYU Abu Dhabi. Bastaki focuses on forced displacement, human rights, refugee law, and citizenship. To this end, she also examines how Islamophobia impacts the rights, belonging, and access of Muslims. We have Dr. Roshan Jangir, who is a Mauritian Canadian Muslim feminist scholar. She holds a PhD in political science from York University. Her research explores the transnational circulation of anti-veiling laws between France and Quebec and their impacts on Muslim women in the context of secularism, feminism, and Islamophobia. And finally, we have Dr. Fatma Jackson Best, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Health, Research Methods, Evidence, and Impact, and the Department of Medicine at McMaster University. Her research explores the impact of Islamophobia on the mental health of Black Muslims and Muslim women in Canada. So I'll hand it over to Sharmin to begin with the presentation.
Thank you so much, Mubashara, and thank you to Bridge.Initiative for holding this space for our discussion of our book. I wanted to start by acknowledging that I'm speaking from the traditional lands of the Muskogee Creek, the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, which is in the Atlanta, Georgia area, who have stewarded these lands and waters for thousands of years. And I also recognize the indigenous people's right to the land, the Palestinians who are now facing a genocide, as well as stand against the genocide in Darfur. I also want to thank Chester Ronning Center at the University of Alberta, who have supported this book project. I want to kind of contextualize this book into my broader research trajectory that I have pursued for some time, and then going to talking about and making some connections to some current events issues. My first research looked at religion and law and how they interact to shape racialization processes in the preemptive prosecutions of Muslims who were targeted, whose constitutional rights were violated, and getting entrapped and as well as in entrapment cases, accused with providing material support to terrorism in the U.S. federal court system. In reviewing those cases, I observed these patterns. I and many others have observed these patterns. How religion was mobilized to justify the discrimination and targeting and the treatment that these young Muslim men and others were encountering in the court system, in the prison system, and whatnot. One of the questions that intrigued me was, how does the federal court knows what is the correct version of Islam, right? There's so many cultures, these men who are and women who are getting targeted and imprisoned, coming from very different backgrounds, cultural backgrounds, interpretation of Islam. So that led me to that research. And one of the things that I observed, the Muslim audience who are observing these cases coming out from the court have this sense, this feeling like, Islam was undermined, misinterpreted, and attacked. So that's one of the, observation and my data from that research, as well as prisoners. These men who were targeted, they were writing at the time. This is about over a decade ago, 2012, around that time. They're writing. You can find this writing on the internet, and they are also talking about how they felt, they're targeted because of their religion, because they're Muslim, because they practice Islam. So this was the narrative that I was collecting at the time. And then around this time, you also have in the U.S. One of the first books on Islamophobia was published by Stephen Sheehy in 2011, and then 2012, Deepak Kumar. These they were looking at examining Islamophobia, looking at the historical, geopolitical context perspectives. And then we also have the critical race theory framework that was promoted, utilized by legal scholars, in particular, Khalid Beydoun and others. So Islamophobia is defined through a geopolitical, historical lens and critical race theory. And I found that there was kind of this, and then the other element in that discussion was how this post 9/11 context of Islamophobia and targeting, the post-Cold era had played a significant role, and the settler colonial state of Israel and Zionism has played a significant role in the targeting and the constructions about ideas about Islam and Muslim. So I felt there was disconnection, disjuncture in what I was collecting from those who were directly impacted and what they were telling me and this scholarship. So that led me to this kind of examination of religion and law. Fast forward to our current moment, in the aftermath of October 7, 2023, we have observed this rising surge of Islamophobia, anti-Palestine racism, anti-Muslim racism, where people, regardless of their ethnicity or religious background, are targeted. Some of them are targeted with material support to terrorism cases as well, as a result of critiquing the Zionist apartheid settler colonial state of Israel. Then we have the case last year, the mayoral campaign, the New York City mayoral campaign of Zohran Mamdani, where he was targeted. However, his campaign was loaded as, praised as, as an attempt to challenge the American Islamophobia in the way he presented himself and then whatnot. Although, like I said, I may have actual question, interpretation of that. But now we're dealing with this eco-collective, geopolitical war in Iran, right, where the religious leader was taken out. What all of these have in common is the figure of the Muslim, the way the figure of the Muslim have been manufactured, defined, and structured in the last 25 years of the war on terror. There's a longer history, of course, but we're talking about this less, the current moment, who are seen as the bad guy, right? That needs to be either you need to reform, become moderate, or if you can't, we need to just eliminate and bring back to a regime change, liberal democracy, what have you. All of this is happening in what Charles Taylor would call, we are in a secular age. So this book sets out to examine the criteria that states the structure of the modern state, such as the settler colonial state of Israel, Canada, US, or the former colonial state, France, UK, Germany. what criteria they use to designate populations, particularly Muslims, as extremist, radical, terrorist. It's a broad brushstroke of population that are labeled and targeted this way. Whether the states have a different faces. It could be ethno-religious state, such as the Zionist state or the Hindu by India. It could be U.S. taking a more authoritarian fascist outlook, right? Or all of which also claim to be multicultural liberal democracies. Also, this includes Muslim majority states such as the UAE that we recently learned their smearing campaign and perpetuating Islamophobia. So these against co-religionists, right? So this book traces the underlying ideological factors, knowledge systems, shared assumptions that operate that undergird these state structures, state systems, and shape their population, citizenry, global citizens, public perceptions of about Islam and Muslim, and perpetuate Islamophobia, anti-Muslim racism. A lot of it through media, and there's a long list of literature about how media perpetuates and construct the figure of the Muslim and perpetuate Islamophobia. This book does not include a chapter on media, primarily because there's a lot of a book that already exists that focuses on media's role in perpetuating Islamophobia. So this collection sets out to explore and analyze the prevailing public and scholarly narratives that characterize Islamophobia primarily as a racial issue or as a form of racism. We argue that this is a kind of limited perspective that tend to overlook the importance of hostility toward Islamic ways of knowing and being in the world, Islamic epistemology and Islamic ontology, which is informed and defined by secularism. And we go on to explore in this book how secularism is implicated in Islamophobia, and not just implicated, but actually actively facilitates Islamophobia. While racism remains kind of the important aspect of the broader understanding of Islamophobia that we have, my colleagues here and others who are contributors to the book presents empirical data and evidences, unpacks the historical, theoretical, and the underlying conceptual model and the structural features or structure of secularism that have shaped, states, their policies, their public spaces, their ideas and knowledge systems about who's acceptable and who's not acceptable within the boundaries of the state, who's excluded or who's included. So this book kind of shifts the attention away, as Mubashara was talking about, from the materialities of Islam, meaning the external features, the markers of religion, the hijab, the beard, the clothing, and whatnot, the daily public rituals that Muslim may be engaging in, 5 daily prayers in your offices or in your school. These are the public expressions of Muslims or Islam that supposedly facilitates the racialization processes, is how we have come to understand the Islamophobia. But we're shifting the focus from that to it is part of that, definitely, but also to the modern colonial knowledge systems, institutional structures, and the mechanism that undergird the contemporary individualized Islamophobia that most people tend to understand Islamophobia as individualized prejudice and whatnot, but also scholarly, we have been discussing the structural framework of it as well, that construct and perpetuate Islamophobia. And we try to, I guess, raise the question also through this, and this was also pointed out by one of the reviewers of the book, how we define Islamophobia and what are the repercussions of how we define it. So I argue in the introductions of the book that anti-Muslim racism and violence that are, part of the political structures, global political structures, geopolitical structures, and the normative values that underride this international order that we as citizens, modern citizens, have come to celebrate as our greatest moral achievement, liberal democracies and secularism, liberalism, and whatnot. But seeing the dispossession of Palestinians, it raises questions. The dispositions and the genocide is not a deviation from Western values, as we hear some of our leaders, talking about, but rather it's a manifestations of the deepest contradiction that exists within liberalism, actually. So viewed through the lenses of Enlightenment philosophies that gave rise, that kind of solidified in the modern state, got solidified in the Enlightenment, post-Enlightenment period. It was introduced maybe in the 1600s, the ideas of it through the Westphalian Treaty. But the logic of exclusion, racialization, sovereignty, these are all part of and practices of the modern state. The modern state understands itself, the original definition of the modern state, it's a bounded homogeneous identity. So it has problem with diversity and whatnot. And so those who defend it aligns with the historical project and development that perpetuate ethnocide, genocide, anti-Muslim violence, and racism. And so these also function as a mirror because it reveals the ethical, the political problems, fissures that is at the heart of secularism, liberalism, nationalism, and the modern project broadly. These are also the themes and the topic that this book engages with and brings and tries to bring clarity to how these phenomena, these liberalism, secularism, nationalism, interact and work together to promote Islamophobia. So our collections challenge the common belief that Islamophobia is just a right-wing, evangelist kind of a product. Only the conservatives are engaged in, but we argue that understanding the right wing and the liberal left type of Islamophobia as a two distinct kind of bigotry is problematic because both of them has similar, again, underneath them they operate through similar, rooted in same colonial, historical, and social context. And which also informs academia. I think I'm raising that issue in my introductions, how academia might have also perpetuated Islamophobia through our own analysis by omitting, by not engaging with the critical study of religion, as we have done with critical study of race. So the book advocates for a decolonial approach to the study of Islamophobia and the activism that is trying to address work against Islamophobia by recentering Muslims and Islamic ways of knowing and being, and the hostility that Muslims are experiencing aspects of living in the world. In public understanding of anti-Muslim racism as kind of the core dimension of Islamophobia is what we're trying to bring attention to. So this collection differs from other works of Islamophobia that looks at kind of regional aspect or the national aspect. We bring the primary lens of our focus is the concept of religion as it is demarcated, defined, manufactured, constructed through the processes of secularism, definition of secularism, how it defines religion and not religion, and how that is applied in evaluating Islam and Muslim, and how all of that has kind of become entangled in producing in the processes of race making and racism. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jinan.
Okay, thank you very much for that great introduction, Sharman, and thank you so much for the Bridge.Initiative for having us and allowing us to discuss this work. So, when I was preparing this, initially paper and then chapter for this book, it was at a time when I was living in the UK. I was actually living in London, and this was during Brexit. And so there was a lot of rhetoric, right, during Brexit, in which even though it was about leaving Europe, there was a lot of anti-Muslim rhetoric that, like, if you stay, all these Muslims are going to come in. And I was thinking, wait a second, what are you talking about, right? And so there was all of this kind of rhetoric about like we need to leave Europe to prevent more Muslims from coming in. And so there was that kind of thing that was happening in the background. At the same time, throughout that time, so I've lived in the UK for more than a decade. I did my undergrad and my PhD there. And so there would always be something that would be kind of exploding in the media that was, problematizing Muslims. And a lot of times you would have the government would also get on board. So this wasn't just, oh, as Sharman was saying, these are some right wingers, these are some, it's these these tabloids that are just sensationalizing something. It was something that actually that seemed to be also at the level of government. Then these reports started coming out, particularly with the conservative government, that, there was Islamophobia within the conservative government. When Sadiq Khan, the mayor, was running to be the mayor, again, the messaging against him was really very, very Islamophobic. And at the same time, I was noticing that even though there was this rhetoric against kind of just Muslims as a whole, there were other Muslims who were actually being welcomed, right? And I was thinking, well, this is interesting because those Muslims who are kind of welcomed at an institutional level, they don't become immune to Islamophobia once they arrive. They still have to, in as much as they partake in the system, they then feel the Islamophobia. But at certain levels, they were actually being welcomed and they were being embraced. And so that was kind of what got me thinking about this paper. And so in this paper and this chapter, what I kind of look at is really the impact of I suppose, secularism, but more so than that, neoliberalism, and who gets to be the good Muslim and who gets to be the bad Muslim, based on two things, right? Based on what they contribute as well as their temporariness. And so if you contribute to this neoliberal order and you bring your capital, then everything that is problematized about Muslims, right? That, their quirks, right? The fact that Muslim women might want, you know, separate areas at mixed pools or separate times at mixed pools. This is seen as incredibly problematic. It's not problematic at all when it comes to wealthier foreigners who kind of come in. When halal food is being problematized and saying we don't want to have to eat halal food, when it comes to, again, wealthy foreigners, it's actually seen as a sign of multiculturalism. And so I looked at that through kind of three I suppose, main incidents that kind of happened within this time period. And so, kind of the first incident was really about this visa waiver in Europe overall, that and the Schengen countries, I mean, that was actually being discussed for a number of Gulf countries, and at the time it was granted for citizens of the UAE. Now, if we just look at it at a citizen level, right? I mean, if you look at, Emiratis who are, Muslim, you will have some of them that are very outwardly Muslim, so you can see their Muslimness. There'll be Muslim, there'll be women who are wearing hijab. Some might not, keep halal or dhabiha, right? But others do, right? And so in a sense, there's no really kind of differentiation in that regard. And yet, in this same time period that I was kind of, looking, so this was kind of the again during this kind of this Brexit period, you had this granting of the visa waiver for these Muslims, again, at that time for the UAE, but it was being discussed for other Gulf Arab countries as well. Even though at the same time, so the conservative government was basically really restricting the ways in which foreigners could remain in the UK. So if you had, studied in the UK, you used to be able to stay for a period afterwards, but they restricted that. If you were living there, you could bring your spouse. They started to restrict it unless you were earning X or Y or Z. So you had all of these restrictions that were being applied to, non-nationals, kind of really like this blanket kind of restrictions. At the same time, you had these Muslims who were being kind of in the UK. It was obviously a separate one. You had the European one, the UK one, basically. Similarly, granted all citizens from different Gulf countries these visa waivers. In Europe, when you look at the European Parliament discussions, and again, the polls at the time were saying how many citizens felt that, Muslims and Islam were not compatible with the European way of life. There were spikes in anti-Muslim incidents and crimes. And yet you had the European Parliament debating this. And the majority basically said the reason why we can grant these people, these Muslims, these visa waivers, is because look at how much they spend when they come here. And the second thing was they they're not going to stay. All of the discussions were kind of they're not going to stay. There's no risk of them trying to come to demand upon our institutions, right? Anything. And also it had to feature obviously was that they pose a low terrorism risk. So this was also something that was again really a big part of those discussions. Even though again at the same time you had, as I mentioned, the rise of kind of anti-Muslim incidents. You had, at the same time, that same conservative government that had granted, the citizens of these Gulf Arab states this visa waiver. They were being accused of peddling Islamophobia, and there was a report written about the Islamophobia of the conservative government. And so you have these two things kind of happening in tandem, and the real kind of difference was the fact that these people would be coming in, they would give us their money, and then they would leave. And you see this in, again, in these other incidents. So there was, again, if you were living in the UK at the time, this was around 2014, 2015, there was this, halal food scandal in which it was discovered that Pizza Express, a very, run-of-the-mill kind of pizza chain, right, very affordable in general, as in like it's mainstream, right? So it was serving halal chicken. And again, even though you would think that these are some tabloids, they're just sensationalizing the story. I mean, at the time, the Deputy Prime Minister, Nick Clegg, actually weighed in on the matter. And he said, I don't mind eating halal food, but it should really be labeled. And I was thinking, is the slaughter of any other type of food labeled? Like, do you buy something and it says, this has been slaughtered in this way? This has been, you don't get that. And so at the same time that again you had this kind of halal pizza, controversy. If you actually went around certain upscale restaurants in certain parts of London, they were very, very clearly, it wasn't a secret. You don't have to kind of whisper to the waiter and say, is this halal? They were actually very clearly labeled that these are halal, right? And again, these are very different kind of international restaurants. But again, those didn't cause any kind of controversy because in a sense they're out of reach for most people, right? It caters for a very specific kind of tourist. But at the same time, it gives this kind of it adds to the kind of the impression or the air of accommodation of this multicultural city, right? I have, kind of other examples. I know my time is almost to a close, so I just want to kind of end with, the last example, which is what are the limits of this accommodation, right? Like when do the Islamophobic tropes, even for those wealthy Muslims or seemingly wealthy Muslims that kind of come abroad, when does that end? And this is when capital is threatened, right? Then kind of this neoliberal ethos will have to rely on a type of nationalism and an Islamophobia in order to kind of to prevent actually this type of competition. And so at the end of 2015, this was during Trump's first term. He basically again he made this big sweeping statement, a total and complete shutdown of Muslims. But obviously this was only kind of global South countries that kind of that were included in that list. There was obviously a lot of there were court cases and so on and so forth. But then what actually happened? So again, you see these wealthy countries kind of being immune, right, from those types of policies. But then suddenly there is this ban on, well, not a ban, but basically a ban on certain electronic devices on a number of airlines that basically came from Muslim majority countries. Um, and these are basically, they were 9 airlines that kind of came from 10 Middle Eastern airports. And IATA, the International Air Transport Association, they disputed the effectiveness of the ban. These countries themselves had really very stringent kind of security at their airports and so on and so forth. But here, the US airlines on their side, they were complaining that these airlines are subsidized by their governments, and so they're not playing fair, right? But that wasn't the public reason that was given. The public reason that was given was, well, ISIS. And you can sell that to the public because obviously, if you're mentioning a Muslim country, it doesn't matter how wealthy, how anything it is, it's still associated, right, with Islam and the danger of Islam. And so that's kind of when this welcome, right, kind of stops. And when the capital is threatened, and when the capital is threatened, you can kind of then rely on Islamophobic tropes, right? In order to basically enact these policies. So I think I went a little bit over time, but I'm sure we'll get to speak more during the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Janan. Roshan, you are up next. And feel free if you go a couple minutes over, it's okay.
Okay. So thank you very much to, you, Mubashara, and the Al-Walid bin Talal Center for Muslim Christian Understanding for the opportunity to speak to you today. I also want to thank Sharmin Siddiqui as well for all the work that she put in to put together this really engaging and timely edited collection. And I'd like to acknowledge also that I'm situated on lands known as Toronto or Toronto in Canada, which is subject to treaties that were signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. And the York University, which is where I'm affiliated, is located on Toronto Purchase Treaty number 13 lands and is situated on the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat and Haudenosaunee. So my contribution to this edited volume is called Good Islam, Bad Islam, Secularism, Separatism, and Islamophobia in France. And I wanted to talk just a little bit more broadly about, what led me to be interested in this topic and to write this particular chapter. So in the introduction, it was mentioned that my doctoral dissertation and research generally touches on the circulation of what I call anti-veiling laws between France and Quebec. And by anti-veiling laws, I mean prohibitions on wearing things like the hijab, but also the niqab. And these prohibitions can take many forms. Most commonly, they take the form of laws, but they can also, take the form of internal policies that are, couched in very neutral language, usually using secularism or sometimes other terms that gesture to religious neutrality to in effect what it amounts to prohibiting Muslim women and girls from practicing a part of their faith, which is a veiling. And so I started noticing when I was, conducting research for my doctoral thesis that many of the laws that had been enacted in France, for example, in 2004, there's this, infamous law that was enacted to prohibit religious symbols in public schools. And mostly the arguments and the debates leading up to this law centered around Muslim practices. So wearing hijab, for example, the young girls in public school wearing hijab. And you had a lot of hysteria around this issue about, these young girls were being forced by the men in their communities, their fathers, their brothers, the quote unquote mullahs or imams in what are known as the banlieue, the suburbs, and the hysteria that was produced around, okay, we need to save these young girls. And a lot of the sort of like rhetoric and the sort of networks of femo-nationalists as well as state nationalists that came together to propose these laws, I found a lot of that being repeated in then debates in Quebec, which is the one of the French language, the province in Canada, where French is the dominant language. And several laws have been proposed in Quebec, and one was actually enacted in 2019 that prohibits various sort of civil servants, judges, lawyers, police officers, and also school teachers from wearing religious symbols. And so, what I wanted to understand was how does Islamophobia circulate transnationally across borders, especially when you have a shared language, French, and a shared colonial history. And this led me to sort of theorize the mechanisms of this circulation and who are the actors involved. What are the discourses actually? How are women? How is gender? And especially the figure of the Muslim woman, how does that figure constantly shift and evolve, but also represent this contrasting, vision of, a figure that needs to be saved, but also a figure that is dangerous because, the Muslim woman is a stand-in or a proxy for terrorists, for Islamic fundamentalists, and that the Muslim woman figure represents a step back, a step, behind. And if sort of we as a Western nations that are progressive and liberal and democratic, if we allow sort of these people and their backward ways to infiltrate all of our schools and our institutions, then what does this mean for women's rights? What does this mean for progressive values, et cetera, et cetera? So you have a lot of discourses that pair secularism with gender equality and that basically ahistorically equate one with the other. So if you call yourself secular, that means automatically you're also for gender equality and progressive feminist values. So with the way that feminism is also mobilized in a very, very particular way to then exclude Muslim women and also take away their rights as citizens. So this particular chapter, which is called Good Islam, Bad Islam, actually looks at France and the way that secularism has actually even been has morphed into another concept called separatism. And I'll talk about it just a little bit before the Q&A. And what in 2021, a law that is known as the separatism law was passed in France. And it accelerated France's surveillance and persecution of both Muslims and French Islam. And it entrenches counterterrorism policies, which were known as the systematic obstruction policies, into law. And what I argue in this chapter is that the separatism law perpetuates the distinction between good Islam, which is silent, politically passive, invisible, and bad Islam, which is visible, politically engaged, and assertive, by using state power to quash Muslim dissent, as well as any practices that the state does not agree with. Although this law is supposedly aimed at countering Islamist separatism, or this concept that is newly coined, which is defined as a type of religious radicalism that leads to separation from the rest of society, In practice, the separatism law grants the government nearly unlimited power to dissolve cultural, educational, religious, and civil rights associations. And so, given its far reaching nature, I argue that the separatism law targets Muslim places of worship, associations, education, as well as Muslim families as part of France's efforts to remake Islam into a version that is compatible with French secularism or laïcité. And I do argue that separatism has accelerated, but also effectively, in some ways, replaced secularism as a tool of governance that not only restricts the visibility of Muslims in France, but also their ability to organize autonomously. And I'll answer, more questions about this law in the Q&A. But basically, this law comes after nearly 20 years or more of legislations that at first targeted Muslim women and girls. And that was seen as sort of acceptable in some ways because, okay, if, minors, for example, are not allowed to wear hijab in schools, okay, that's not a big deal. And then, in 2010, there was another law that targeted Muslim women who wore niqab. So not being able to access or walk around in public space. But now, 20 years later, after the ground has been sort of laid, you find that the government is actually going after all sort of Muslims, anyone who sort of practices in a visible way Orthodox Islam, if you will, eats halal, grows a beard, fasts during Ramadan, prays at work. So all of these sort of normative Orthodox kind of behaviors and practices that normally would be protected under the various conventions that protect human rights and civil rights, freedom of religion. Now you find that these are actually being undermined for the entire community. So it's not just Muslim women and girls. It started with them, but now it's sort of entire Muslim communities, Muslim organizations, as well as the very meaning of Islam. So what does Islam even look like? If there are so many prohibitions, you're not actually allowed to practice in the way of your conscience. You're not actually allowed to express yourself. So what does that do to sort of like the rights that are meant to be protected under a liberal democracy? So those are some of the questions that I deal with in this chapter, and I'd be happy to answer more questions. Thank
Thanks,
you.
Roshan. Fatma, you are up next.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak today and to share the chapter that I contributed to this book. Thank you, Roshan, for doing the land acknowledgement. I'm in the same territory land as Roshan here in Toronto. And a lot of my work focuses on Toronto, Canada, Black communities across the nation. And I think maybe just to give a little bit of foregrounding for the book chapter, I've done a lot of health research, looking at social health equity and improving access to healthcare for Black people across the country, and also some research in the Caribbean. And back in 2019, I was partnered with a community-based organization called the Black Muslim Initiative and a Muslim-focused research think tank called the Tesla Institute. And that year we launched findings from a research project that was about Black Muslims in Canada. And the importance of this work lies in the fact that Black Muslims have a really long history in Canada, but at that point, there was no synthesis of available information about our communities. And this is also balanced with the fact that Black Muslims are also visible, but we're left out of discussions about Muslims in Canada and Blackness in Canada. So that invisibility or that perceived invisibility in some of this landscape led me to work with these two organizations to develop a scoping review that focused on Black Muslims in Canada. And one of the key findings was about the experience of being Black and Muslim in Canada. And so, based on this, we were able to see how Black Muslims were living, basically having intersectional experiences. So, have experiencing the specific kinds of racism and discrimination that only Black Muslim individuals who live and traverse this world as being Black, but also being Muslim, were essentially erased from dominant narratives about Muslim identities by both non-Black Muslims and non-Muslims. And so it's a concept that was put forward and coined by Delise Mugabo. It's called anti-Black Islamophobia. And so that was one of the key findings of that work. And as I, worked on this work and ended up doing other research about Black communities, I couldn't help but notice the ways that Islamophobia and anti-Black Islamophobia were showing up in media, in the reporting of hate crimes, etc., across the country. And so I had this, I guess I could say I started to have this kind of hunch that there was a lot of Black Muslims were experiencing anti-Black Islamophobia and violent anti-Black Islamophobia. And we started to see some really concerning cases coming out of Alberta around Black Muslim women who were assaulted, physically assaulted in public places in parts of the province. And this was coupled also with the rise and continuation of anti-Muslim hate crime reporting happening to police across Canada. And so over the years, I had been hearing about these kinds of experiences and also statistics and information that was coming out about Black Muslim women who were being assaulted. And it really led me to think critically about what the mental health implications of this can be and are. And I've come across a lot of different, mostly news articles that focus on the experiences of Black Muslim women, but there was one that stood out in 2023 where it chronicles the experience of a Black Muslim woman who was working in a restaurant and had been assaulted by a customer, essentially. And a lot of the interview focused on her mental health response to it, the challenges, the anxiety, the fear, the depression, the trauma that she had experienced after that assault. And there was it really indicated to me that not only is there you know, social, this social and personal or interpersonal experience of Islamophobia, but there's also deeply rooted mental health impacts of this. And so this led to the book chapter that I contributed to this project. And my chapter really explores mental health and Islamophobia, and it focuses on how Islamophobic incidences like the ones that I've described cause marginalization, trauma, and then also how that can extend to the mental health care that even Black Muslim women and Muslims are seeking to access and receive. So the fact that you can experience you can have a mental health response to or mental health challenges related to an Islamophobic incident, and when you're seeking out help, for that mental health outcome, you're still engaging or being subjected to Islamophobia in the mental health care services that are provided, which don't recognize your Blackness or your Muslimness, and the overlap of that. And a lot of my work, because it's focused on Canada, the story is not complete. The information is not readily accessible because we have, lack of access to race-based data here in the country. And so I really had to look at US research, which indicates like a very strong relationship that exists between experiences of discrimination and mental health challenges, and couching my work in that allowed me to explore the Canadian information on Islamophobia, which also asserts that there is prolonged stress that impacts people who have been subjected to anti-Black Islamophobic violence, and that makes them susceptible to other illnesses and other mental health disorders. And amongst that research, of course, we know that people who are visibly Muslim will bear the brunt of this. And so a lot of the work in Canada that I came across focuses on hijab wearing Muslim girls and women who become targets for violent Islamophobia, and also the legislative violence that Roshan speaks to or spoke to right here in our neighboring province of Quebec. And so this book chapter, for me, it's an offering to explore an area that doesn't have as much information produced about it, but it is an offering for me, or this chapter, it features for me like an offering from my program of research, which is focused on mental health outcomes and gender-based Islamophobia and anti-Black Islamophobia in a Canadian context, helping to build up that data. So working on quantitative research and qualitative research, but it's all been made possible because I was able to think about Black Muslim bodies and Black bodies within the secular project who have never been considered to be even human. And there's so much important research and work that's been done about, the human and the erasure or the not even erasure, the non-consideration of Black people. So, this book chapter allowed me to kind of couch my ideas of within that secular project, but to also see how in this secular project, how mental health care it's the access to it is also mitigated by Islamophobia and anti-Blackness essentially. And so I think I'll stop there. I want to make sure that we have enough time for questions and answers. But again, thank you so much for the opportunity to share. And yes, I'm hoping that everybody will read these chapters and find some inspiration, some ideas, some points of thought to enrich our own lives and hopefully essentially remove these kinds of structures from our societies. So thank you so much again.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for those presentations that provided a really good overview of each of your interests, but also I think attest to how broad Islamophobia is, how it impacts individuals differently, how it manifests differently, and how it's a transnational issue. It is not focused on one country, the US, but it is global in its impact and its consequences. I've got a few questions and I'll direct them at individuals, but if you have your own thoughts, please feel free to jump in. Um, Sharman, my first question is to you. So in my work, and I'm sure in all of your work, you have seen constant arguments from both right and left-wing circles about the need for Islam to be, quote, reformed. From an individual level, we have self-described Muslim reformists who essentially argue for kind of a secularized, sanitized sort of version of Islam that is relegated to the private sphere. And then on an institutional level, we have state projects. We have in France, we have the Secularism, the Islamist separatism project. In China, we have Sinicization of Islam, which is advocated by Xi Jinping. What role has secularism played in these conversations and in the larger conversations of how we understand how race and religion operate today?
Okay, thank you for that question. Let's see here. This idea of reformed Islam, which basically means, this moderate, this idea of the good Muslim, bad Muslim, the moderate, secularized Islam is the reformed Islam, where it is coming from the individuals reforming themselves, the institutional level or the state level, such the one example you mentioned around China and France as well. For me, I think before I get to talking about these ideas of reformed Islam that we see emerging in the last 25 years in the war on terror, we may want to understand the reforming of Islam that may have already happened under European colonialism, and how that experience and those projects have already defined Islam in a particular way. And reshaped Muslim societies, Muslims' understanding of Islam, right? Reshaped the political, legal governance system of Muslim societies, educational system in particular, the knowledge systems has already been modified, transformed under colonial experiences of the 18th, 19th centuries. And so there's a particular way that that Europeans at the time in this 18, 19, European colonizations, the modern colonialism, uh, they were not only extracting, labors and economic resources, or just extending political power, the imperial political power over these in the global South, but also their ideas that shaped their societies because of their own historical experiences. And Irfan Ahmed talks about this, the Enlightenment thinkers, right, and how the whole project was a very ethnic, ethnic project. It says a European history for Europeans, that they took, to the global South, thinking their model is the most, superior and rational, reasonable model. And so that also include the secularized understanding of religion, around their understanding of Christianity that they have already experienced from 1600 to, up until the Enlightenment, post-Enlightenment, when things got really solidified. The idea of the modern state structure got solidified. The idea of the separation of church and state got solidified in the post-Enlightenment era. You have scientific revolution happens around this time of 17th century, 1700 on and whatnot. We also want to look at some of these European history in a decolonized way, or maybe look at in a more holistically, some of these things that they're experiencing around 1600, these wars of religion that happened between the Protestant and Catholic that led to the separation of, redefining their society, actually restructuring their society, where the church was removed from having any governance ability and any authority over the state. So, uh, uh, and then post-Enlightenment era, which is going through again this kind of changes in the 1800s. You have Darwinian theories being introduced in Europe at the time, and this was the time also they are colonizing the global South. That mission was a civilizing mission, modernizing mission. The global South experienced modernity through colonialism. And that's why you have decolonial thinkers such as Walter Mignola talking about, with modernity, coloniality is kind of this phrase that he uses. Talk about the ideas of colonialism still exist within the post-colonial context in the global South, and how that have shaped people's understanding of their own faith traditions. If you were I moved here in the US in the 1980s. In the 1980s, women did not go to the mosque in Bangladesh. The mosque were only for rituals, only like 5 daily prayers, only men were going to the mosque. And then things began to change. In the 1990s, we see this beginning of the revivalism of Islam in different parts of the world, in the global South. So the idea of reformist Islam, this is very much a project of secularism coming from the colonial experiences that we have now in the post 9/11 context. Is the American version of reforming and civilizing mission through the process of American secularism that we have been experiencing. So these and they revolve around this idea of the good Muslim and the bad Muslim, or the secular Muslim are considered to be the reformist Muslim, and they're aligned with the Western project as well as the Zionist project. We have heard Netanyahu talking about the moderate Palestinian that he wants to work with, right? So this is again aligned with the Western colonial project as well as the Zionist project, who defines what is an acceptable version of Muslim and Islam that they want to work with. So.
Thank you, Sharman. Janan, my next question is to you, and it's actually from your presentation, and you contextualized what got you interested in your chapter and the ideas you addressed. And you talk about Britain. So I live in London. I was here in 2014, 2015, and I remember the sort of hysteria that was happening around the halal meat and stuff. I wanted to get your thoughts on today in Britain, because I'm seeing sort of the same sort of hysteria coming out. And while it's not, it's not Brexit, it's basically we have reform and coming to power. And in reform, you have Muslim politicians or self-described Muslim politicians. And then in labor, you have defined Muslim politicians who are also pushing what I would argue are very far-right policies. How do they um, fit into this good Muslim, bad Muslim category of acceptance? Because it's not temporariness. Is it, and I don't know if it's contribution, but they've become almost central or key points in this new political sphere that we have,
Mhm.
where Muslim voices are brought in, and they defend policies that target Muslims. Yeah, so
Mhm.
I'd like to get your thoughts on that.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, I think, those groups of people have, always existed, right? I mean, you look at across the political spectrum, and obviously it becomes more, um, I don't know what the word, more jarring when you see them in groups like Reform who are very overt, right? Rather than groups that might be a bit more subtle in the way that they want to shape Muslim communities, and so on and so forth. So yeah, it's not that it has to do with temporariness and so on and so forth. I think the acceptability, like that goes back to, I think, the quintessential binary of the good Muslim versus bad Muslim, right? The good Muslim is the one that kind of sheds their Muslimness, right? And they join whatever, in this case, let's say political group, right? And they take on, and then they become kind of, the in a sense, the token Muslim, right? That, see, these Muslims agree with us, right? Like, look at these Muslims agree with us. They even agree that their religion is bad, or their community is bad, or their community has to reform, right? So I think it's a very kind of different thing, because here we're talking about kind of individuals who kind of join these, larger groups. Whereas when we talk about, I suppose, the temporariness of groups of Muslims kind of coming in that otherwise might not be welcomed, there the temporariness and the capital, in a sense, has much more to do with their acceptability than the ones that already exist as kind of as citizens and are need to model, right, that good Muslim, not based on the fact that they are temporary, right, but based on the fact that, they portray, right, the good Muslim based on, the notion of what a good Muslim is in those spheres, right? Because we're going to see it's also kind of a spectrum. Kind of, when we talk about good Muslim, bad Muslim, we have this, the good Muslim is kind of the secular Muslim, and so on and so forth. Then, kind of the bad Muslim is, this is the religious Muslim, the one that can't change their ways, and so on and so forth. But I think it's actually really a spectrum. It's not just this or the other. And so when you have kind of somebody joining Reform and then problematizing their own community, problematizing their religion, and saying this is what we need to do, right? They also kind of fall under the really good Muslim for that kind of group, right? And then you have kind of a little bit kind of that's a little bit more subtle, and so on and so forth. So yes, I think, the temporariness kind of aspect to it, it really has to do with when you're not just welcoming one or two people, which I think has always happened throughout history. There's always the exception, or even always the token. But when we're talking about welcoming kind of groups of people in ways and that others are problematized for, right? So when the hijab is problematized, but not for them. When halal food is problematized, but not for them. When, specific requests related to their Muslimness, right, is problematized, but not for them, right? There it has to do with kind of with the capital and with the temporary kind of nature that, like, okay, if we wanted, we could always change this, right? We can accommodate them now because of the capital that they bring. So I hope that kind of answers.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. Roshan, my next question is to you. And you talked about this in your presentation about French government's project of Islamist separatism and how it's the next step from the secularism project. Could you help us, our audience, could you, for them, define, help say how the French government defines it, and what is the French government seeking to do when it comes to Islam and how it's practiced by French Muslims? What is their ultimate, I guess, goal, or what is their desired outcome from this project?
Thanks for that. Great question. I talk about how the French government defines this concept of Islamist separatism, and it actually like comes from the concept of separatism, which has been used by different groups throughout French history, colonial history, especially minority groups, to advocate for a separation from the state in a decolonial kind of register. But in this moment and in this law, Islamist separatism is not theorized as some kind of violent political movement or terrorist action, but it includes non-violent behaviors that the French state claims leads to Muslims separating or withdrawing from the wider French society. So it's this idea of communitarism also. But basically, the idea is that everyone who dresses differently, who has special dietary requirements, who performs non-normative, ritual practices, such as, for example, having a beard, wearing an abaya or a hijab, a kami, eating halal food, fasting during Ramadan, etc. Anyone who does these things is characterized as an Islamist or an Islamist separatist. And so basically, Islamic religious orthodoxy is characterized as Islamist. And so this is one of the ways that the French state uses to demarcate the good Muslim from the bad Muslim. It's very sort of like apparent, visual, visible, who is, part of us and who is not part of us. And so it's sort of important to place this within the context of these counterterrorism policies that have been enacted since, for example, the Charlie Hebdo attacks, since the attacks at the Bataclan in 2015, where a lot of counterterrorism policies that were supposed to be temporary are now actually embedded into law. So they're permanent. And so the separatism law that was enacted in 2021 has been used to dissolve or close down schools, Muslim schools, private schools, mosques, Muslim associations, especially the high-profile association called the Collective Against Islamophobia in France, the CCEF, which was a high-profile like NGO that advocated for Muslim civil and human rights. And the government used this idea of Islamist separatism to argue that critiquing state Islamophobia was tantamount to legitimizing terrorism. So you couldn't actually critique state Islamophobia because that would be in and of itself a way of legitimizing terrorism. And so this idea and this concept has been used to also suppress left-wing organizations in France, calling them Islamo-gauchist, Islamo-leftism, also to suppress Palestinian organizing and advocacy. And so what initially started as secularism as a mode of governing Muslim communities and Muslim individuals has now morphed into separatism, which criminalizes the activities that normally one would associate with a democracy, sort of like freedom of association, freedom of expression, freedom of religion. Now when these things are done by Muslims, they're criminalized. And so these organizations are dissolved, so their funding is suspended, schools have been closed, things like that. So I think that the ultimate goal is actually to shut down any kind of Muslim dissent and the ability of the Muslim community to organize autonomously. So in a way that would respond to their needs and the needs that the French state is not meeting clearly. So I think that's what's at stake.
Thank you, Roshan. Fatma, one thing before I ask my question, I did want to highlight when I was reading your chapter, and I read the part about the Black Muslim women who were being targeted. It was around end of 2020, beginning of 2021. I specifically remember reading the headlines coming out during that time because I do a daily headlines newsletter for Bridge. And it was like 5 or 6 attacks, I believe. And I remember thinking there is something really dangerous happening here, but I didn't remember seeing any sort of analytical article about what was happening. They weren't even within the articles themselves, it wasn't talking about the connections about how it was Black Muslim women being targeted. Not just a hijabi woman, but also talking about her race. And I found your chapter helped me better understand how that came to be because of the erasure of those identities, the Black Muslim women identity. But there was also a part in your chapter that, and you touched on in your presentation about who is considered human. And I think that for me really underscores a lot of the conversation we're happening here today of who is considered and who defines who is human. So I wanted to ask you, how does the secular definition of the human continue to structure whose humanity and whose trauma is recognized within mental health institutions?
Oh, such a good question. I mean, when you look at mental health, I guess I could work myself backwards on the question. But when you look at mental health institutions, there was no consideration of the human. That's how the asylums have been structured. And atop that structure, obviously, been deinstitutionalized, deconstructed. But those kinds of ways of thinking about humanness and who fits in have just maintain those rigid and invisibilizing approaches. So where women have been invisibilized, Black people have been invisibilized, queer people have been invisibilized, other people from with different intersecting identities and experiences would be invisibilized. The idealized person, body, experience that these institutions have been created around are very visibilized people. So typically white, male, able-bodied, heterosexual people. And so, the ways that I guess that this institution has been structured, it continues to function in that way. And so, yes, I guess experiences of violent Islamophobia, that's one iteration of this invisibilization, but then hyper visibilization. What my chapter is like getting at, and I think what you rightly are identifying, is the ways that this features into the help seeking trajectories of Black Muslim women, Black people, Muslim women, etc. Um, so I mean, I think that we always have to go back to like the formations, the foundations of our structures and of our societies to understand why there is an uptick in, specific violence experiences of anti-Black Islamophobia, but also, a marring and a silencing of who it's happening to. I agree with you. The chapter absolutely talks, it speaks to that, to why that happens and why Black people are Black Muslim women are targets for this, and it really does have to do with that secular project. I'm thinking a lot about I can't I tried to look up her name before I answered this question, but a Caribbean scholar who talks about like the human and the contours of that, but the ways in which women's bodies, Black people's bodies aren't excluded from that human making that secular project. And so, for I guess from that perspective, when I was writing the chapter, I had to re-recognize that, yeah, the secular project and Blackness and Black Muslimness are oftentimes like incompatible and like not even considered essentially. And so what does that mean for help seeking and for help seeking in an era where, we are still, at least in Canada, experiencing some forms of EDI and inclusion, right? So how do we start to fold that into the ways that, or how are we seeing that folded into the ways that people are accessing care, or care is trying to be tailored to people's needs and experiences and these histories. So I mean, like I said, this chapter really for me is like the beginning of my thoughts about this, and it's led to scoping reviews that I've recently completed looking at mental health outcomes of Islamophobia in Canada, and a new scoping review that I'm engaging in that's looking specifically at mental health access, and the barriers and facilitators to care that exist for Muslims who have access mental health care services and care, because that hunch that I had while writing this ended up leading to a scoping review that's showing that, there's actually a huge problem when it comes to access, right? So, these are all part of like our secular organizations, our secular structures, our secular societies. And, I think that my intention behind this is always to bring those invisibilized voices, experiences, perspectives to the fore through research. So, yeah, it's a great question. Thank you, Mubashir. I hope that answers at least some part of it.
One of the questions that I had right before this talk actually started, and it has to do with the current events going on, and anyone can take this question. We recently had U.S. Secretary of War Pete Hegseth invoke Christian prayer during a speech talking about the U.S. and Israel's joint attacks on Iran. And towards the beginning, when the attacks were first launched, Hegseth also used religiously bigoted language targeting Iran, describing the country as having, quote, prophetic Islamist delusions. These attacks are being spoken about and defended, almost justified through a religious lens by a supposedly secular country. I wanted to get any one of your thoughts on the current situation and the sort of rhetoric that we are hearing coming out from the US, which also invokes crusader rhetoric as well. And it kind of reminds me of the post 9/11 environment right after the 9/11 attacks and the Bush administration. So I'd be interested to get all of your thoughts on that.
I'll share some thoughts here on that one. So yes, so this idea that supposedly the individuals are representative of a secular state, right? And they're invoking religious rhetorics. I think it's Elizabeth Shackman Hart's work, and then also looking at some of I forget the name of the person who discusses well, I think I cite her. The idea, the separation of church and state, right, which is not how it actually operates in reality, right? We see politicians are always invoking religion. The way I understand it, because it is envisioned that way, that religion should not be meddling with the governance of the state, right? And it had suppressed or marginalized religious entities, right? Religious personalities or ways of living and thinking and doing work that give rise to this white nationalist Christian uprising, because they feel like they've marginalized and they want to claim the modern state. The original definition of the modern, and I see a question also about the modern state, whether or not it is uniformed. It has it has a different faces. It functions differently on the surface, but this underlying logic that emerged from the Westphalian Treaty, this original definition, it's a bounded homogeneous identity. And so when we have the white nationalists or others Hindu that claiming that is their nation, they're not wrong in defining and invoking that original definition. But in reality, the states are all very diverse, always have been, right? It's just that we have, and then the way this separation of church and state operates, it marginalizes, different religious ways of living, and that gives rise to this political claim to the state that they want to have it in their way. so that's how I see that this targeting on Iran, and again looking at the global South as if it's religious oriented, the bad Islam is going on there, so we need to regime change. So again, defining it along the line of secularism, right? He's invoking religion, but he's actually also operating within the secular realm of defining the other as something really deviant or outside.
Thank you, Sharman. I'm going to move on to some audience questions. We have one for Fatma. The person has two questions. First, are these projects that are working to address the bias of are there projects that are working to address the bias of historic data? You talked about this, I think, in your presentation. How do you even address the biases that have of historic data? And secondly, as a queer Muslim woman, where do I fit in these narratives? Some LGBTQ spaces are very welcoming, while others seem to adopt this extreme erasure of Islam.
Okay, thank you so much. I think that when it comes to the first part of the question about projects that work to address bias of historic data, of course, there's always, re-archiving projects. There is, knowledge dissemination via book chapters that bring up, deinstitutionalization and the issues, many of the issues that I've listed when it comes to mental health care and the historic data there. But and so there's always a plethora of projects that look at that, or there exists a plethora of projects that have done that and are doing that. Um, I would say to address and in my own research, I should say, sorry to personalize it, I'm always interested in the foundations and the historic part of why our societies are built in the ways that they are. And so all of my work necessitates and engages with historical context so that I can provide that kind of foundational information to readers so that we understand that this doesn't come from nowhere, right? This is not new. All of these things are reimaginings and repurposing of the same kinds of package of discrimination that have been plaguing multiple communities and groups for centuries, which include obviously LGBTQ communities, right? And so to get to the second part of your question, I think that it's incumbent upon us to figure out where where we want to intervene into these narratives and how we want to intervene into these narratives. If organizing spaces are welcoming, then this can be a great facilitator for us to enact change. If they're not welcoming in the ways that in some of the ways that I've heard, it's important for us to figure out other ways that we're going to decide to intervene. Um, and recognizing that some of these spaces are meant to, like, that's their purpose, they're meant to erase. And so it really depends on, the ways that I intervene depends on my passion for it and the importance for it. So, of course, I've experienced Black organizing spaces where Islam is not, there's Islamophobia or people who are enacting Islamophobia. And how I decide to engage depends on my commitment to the organization and my commitment to the work. And how I engage also depends on my capacity. So that's something for us to gauge and to put out and to pursue. But yeah, so I think that ensuring that we, of course, intervene in these kinds of spaces in the ways that we can, but we also have our own spaces, right? Our own networks, our own groups of friends and allies, etc. And those are the places, those are microcosms for the rest of how we engage with the world and for the rest of the world. And so those spaces, whether formal or informal, are just as important. And capitalizing off of and nurturing those kinds of supportive spaces are always going to be incredibly important and possibly also just as important use of our energy as organizing spaces.
I want to add to that the question around the queer and identity and the spaces of being Muslim. There's when I looked at the question, the immediately that came to mind is the book by Jasbir Kaur, Terrorist Assemblages and Homonationalism in Queer Times, where she's talking about how liberal politics incorporates, queer politics, LGBTQ politics, but at the same time uses that to promote Islamophobia. And so that just from your descriptions, it's like something like this is happening where you're accepted in some groups because the shared identity, because the liberal politics of those spaces, and then where maybe the groups are seeing your Islam identity, the Muslim identity more strongly, or however way they're envisioning that it making engaging in exclusion of those identities. So so something like this is happening, and I think that book might shed some light in terms of what's going on in these spaces.
Thank you, everyone. So we've come to the end of our session, but thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I learned so much again. I'm going to tell everyone I've put the link to purchase the book in the chat. Please check it out. It is truly, I think, very revolutionary in the way that we approach Islamophobia, in the way that we study it, and in the way that we analyze it. And again, the chapters address a range of topics, so there's something that will be of interest to everyone. Again, thank you all for joining us today. We will be putting a recording of this on Bridge's website, and we'll be sharing it on our social media. So do take a look. And yeah, that's all I have for today. Thank you again, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you,
Thank you for
Mubashara,
having
and
us.
everybody
Thank
else.
you
Take
so
care.
much. Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.